El Silbón, an urban horror legend. This story takes place in the 1980s in a beautiful South American village named Los Llanos, where greenery and vast fields stretched in all directions. A boy named Damaso was staying at his uncle's house for the holidays near one of those fields. People in the village usually went to bed early, so after having dinner in the evening, everyone had already gone to sleep. Damaso lay on his bed, but he couldn't fall asleep and kept staring at the ceiling fan. Suddenly, he heard a loud sound of animals crying. He got up and went outside, only to find that the sound was coming from a nearby animal shelter where many cows were kept. Damaso looked up at the sky and saw that it was covered with dark clouds. He thought that maybe the cows were scared of an approaching storm. So he decided to move them to the inner stable for safety. But as he started moving them, he noticed something strange. The cows were unusually restless. It was as if they sensed something terrifying, which made it difficult for Damaso to guide them. The rain had also started pouring heavily. As he struggled to move a few cows inside, a strong, rotten smell of raw meat filled the air. The more he moved the cows, the stronger the stench became. Then, when only 5 or 6 cows were left outside, he saw something horrifying: the blood-stained bones of an old cow lying on the ground. Damaso froze in shock and screamed. Before he could react or run away, a distant whistling sound echoed through the stormy night. The sound was so eerie that it sent chills down his spine. And in that moment, Damaso knew he was about to die, because that whistle belonged to El Silbón, and El Silbón was coming for him. Damaso had heard many stories about El Silbón. He remembered how his relatives told tales of a man who once encountered this terrifying entity. According to the story, that man was traveling alone on horseback through a vast field late at night to attend an event. Suddenly, his horse tripped over something and nearly fell. When he got down to check, he found a deer's bones with rotting flesh still attached. Before he could process what he saw, he heard a blood-curdling whistle in the distance. Panicked, he tried to get his horse up and escape, but it was already too late. From the shadows, he heard a heavy thud, as if something enormous had landed on a nearby tree. He looked up and saw a monstrous figure lurking in the dark. Then, out of nowhere, something struck his head with immense force. A bone thrown at him with deadly accuracy. His head split open and he screamed for help. But it was useless, because death itself had arrived in front of him. Standing before him was a 19-foot-tall, horrifying creature. It wore a wide-brimmed hat, but its body was a grotesque nightmare. Its flesh was rotting, and its bones were visible. The rider had never seen such a terrifying being. On its back, it carried a large sack full of bones. One by one, it took out the bones from the sack and started beating the rider mercilessly. The poor man begged for his life, but the creature didn't stop. It continued to tear flesh from his body and devour him alive. The next morning, villagers found the rider's lifeless skeleton lying in the field. Only bones remained. People say that the 19-foot-tall skeletal figure was El Silbón, and even today he wanders that land in search of victims. Back in the present, Damaso's mind was racing with fear. Before he could even think of running, a huge shadow suddenly appeared on the ground, and then, emerging from that shadow, was a gigantic, horrifying man. He was wearing a straw hat, his rotting flesh hung loosely from his body, and he was more than 19 feet tall. It was El Silbón. The creature slowly started moving toward Damaso. On its back, the blood-stained sack of bones rattled loudly. The sound of the bones clashing together grew louder, but even louder was the pounding of Damaso's own heart. Terrified, he ran for his life. He could feel El Silbón chasing him, leaping from tree to tree like a monstrous predator. Damaso kept screaming for help, but suddenly, El Silbón landed right in front of him. With his long, decayed hands, he reached out to grab Damaso. Just then, the sound of a dog barking pierced through the night. El Silbón instantly froze in fear. In the blink of an eye, he vanished into thin air. Damaso turned around and saw his pet dog, which had come running after hearing his screams. Later, Damaso would say that if his dog hadn't been there that night, he would have ended up inside El Silbón's sack of bones. After that terrifying night, Damaso couldn't stop thinking about El Silbón. He asked his relatives and other villagers about the legend, and what they told him was even more horrifying than what he had experienced. They revealed that El Silbón's story was true. According to legend, centuries ago, a spoiled young boy lived in the area with his family. Being an only child, he was given everything he wanted. One day, he demanded that his father bring him deer meat for dinner. His father took his hunting rifle and a sack and went into the forest. However, when his father didn't return for a long time, the boy became furious. His mother, worried for his safety, gave him a sharp kitchen knife and told him to find his father. When the boy returned, he wasn't alone. He had brought back a sack full of meat, organs, and bones, and gave it to his mother, saying, "Here's the deer meat." As she started cooking, she felt uneasy. Something was off. Suspicious, she told her father-in-law. The grandfather then took the boy outside, tied him to a tree, and whipped him mercilessly until he confessed the truth. The boy had found his father empty-handed in the forest and, in a fit of rage, had murdered him. He then butchered his father's body, stuffed the pieces into a sack, and brought them home as deer meat. Horrified, the grandfather poured chili and alcohol on the boy's wounds, then placed his father's bones on his back and set his hunting dogs after him, banishing him forever. Since that day, the boy's cursed spirit became known as El Silbón, the Whistler, forever wandering, hunting.